the unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth, is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. So, this morning I'd like to talk a little bit about vows. We take vows pretty much every day in our practice. We just vowed this morning to make the Buddha's truth one with ourselves. So why do we do that? First, a little bit of context. Buddhism originated with the Buddha when, as a young, privileged person, he kind of woke up in the middle of his life and realized that suffering was all around him. That beings were having a difficult time for a variety of reasons. And in this recognition, there was a movement of the Buddha's heart. He had compassion arise. This wasn't just an idea about suffering and the wish to alleviate suffering. This was a movement in him. It was a kind of revolution within him. He was moved by this compassion, this wish to do something about suffering, to such an extent that he set aside his comfortable life and went in pursuit of the answer to the problem of suffering. Now, there are many worthy things in the world, many worthy pursuits, and then there are many things to do in the world that may not be worthy. Many things. For whatever reason, the Buddha decided that he would address the problem of suffering through spiritual practice. He could have become a doctor or what they called a wheel-rolling king, a politician. Many different ways of approaching the problem of suffering. But in the case of the Buddha, he decided to address the problem of suffering through spiritual practice. So everything that we have in Buddhism comes from that compassionate wish. What can I do about suffering? How can I understand it? How can I train myself to go beyond it? How can I help others to find a way to go beyond it? There are many different forms suffering can take, as many as there are beings appearing in the world, each unique. But one of the things that the Buddha discovered and that can help us is that even though we might feel our suffering to be and experience it to be boundless, all-encompassing, the insights of the Buddha is that this is not the case. There's something bigger than our suffering. Often we feel isolated, separated, lonely, excluded. We might feel grief, despair. You fill in the blank. One of the things that the Buddha understood through his own exploration of his own suffering, his own isolation, separation, loneliness, exclusion, grief, despair, is that there is a cause of suffering, and that when we find the cause of suffering and cease that cause of suffering, suffering itself ceases. He found a way to actually deal with the suffering in our own mind. Now, again, an important sort of add-on effect, a sort of follow-up on the Buddha's effort to find the solution to suffering in spiritual practice is that the Buddha's solution for suffering happens within the individual's heart. He didn't talk about suffering as a social ill that could be corrected by fixing society's issues. Buddhism addresses, even though social ills may need to be addressed and can be worthy of attention, for the purposes of practice, for the purposes of understanding the Buddha Dharma, the Buddha emphasized what happens in an individual's heart. When we take up the Buddha's teaching and practice, we are taking up a teaching and practice which focuses on an individual's heart. Reverend Master Jiyu Kennett would say, we've got to try to do something about ourselves. In her book, The Wild White Goose, she wrote, when I went to the East, I was an angry young woman who had questions about why there was war and hatred and fighting in the world. I'm paraphrasing, not getting the quote exact. But the question I should have asked was, why am I as I am? Why is there hatred and ill will in my own heart? Why am I as I am? So the focus of practice is on that question. Why do I suffer? And what can I do about it? And thus we come to vows. Most of us begin practice because we are in a bad state. We have encountered suffering in our life, and it is driving us. We do not perhaps understand what that suffering is, and we are simply driven by suffering. And we hear about the Dharma, and we come to practice. And the teachers tell us, and maybe we've heard for ourselves, and maybe we even have an intuition of it, there is something greater than our suffering. there is something beyond it. There is a way to heal it, to assuage it. And so we take up practice. We take up meditation. And we take up the precepts. And there is perhaps our first encounter with the idea of vows. The way I think about the precepts is the Buddha is very kindly saying, okay, you have come to me to ask about suffering, and I say, look at these areas of life. Look at killing and stealing, lying, misusing sexuality, taking intoxicants, being proud of yourself and devaluing others, and the rest. Look at these areas of suffering and see whether they apply to you. Look and see. Try to restrain yourself if you notice that you're doing one or the other of these things, these actions contrary to the precepts. See how that works. Always in the Dharma is given to us for us to practice. Again, it comes down to us. Now, it comes down to us, and one of the first of the precepts is take refuge in the Sangha. Be part of a community. The Buddha goes so far as to say that good spiritual friends are the whole of the holy life. So there seems to be a contradiction here. Do something about yourself and involve yourself with other people. Maybe there's a contradiction, maybe there isn't. I will encourage you to sit still with that, not try to resolve it with your mind if there is a contradiction, but just sit still with it. Much of our suffering arises in relation to other people, other beings. Either we've done something to them, or they've done something to us, or we want something from them, or they want something from us. It's right in there. And within the Soto Zen tradition, we practice in what's called the Mahayana tradition. So the precepts that we take are called the Bodhisattva precepts. And there we come to our next set of vows, the Bodhisattva vows. And the first of those vows is, however innumerable beings may be, I vow to save them all. So the welfare of others is put in a way front and center, even though our good Zen teachers are telling us, yeah, look at what your own mind is doing. Now, this is not an accident. We have the capacity to arrange life in such a way that our suffering doesn't come up. This is what we could call environmental Zen. We change the circumstances of our life to make ourselves feel peaceful. We, in effect, sort of create a gated community around ourselves and only let the nice people in. With our manicured lawns and our comfortable houses, metaphorically speaking. And one of the effects then of training with the Sangha is we can't really control what other people are doing. We are in fact asked explicitly not to try to control what other people are doing. And this is very helpful. And in the long run, this will go to the solution to the problem of isolation and separation and loneliness. One of the challenges of our practice is that we see only a tiny amount of what is going on in our own mind. We are asked to look at why we are as we are, and honestly, we basically don't have any idea when we start. We might have read a few books, might have done some therapy, and maybe we do have some clues, but what we don't see is the actual functioning of our mind and how these ideas that we encounter actually play out in our individual life. We just don't see it. I'm speaking, of course, from my own experience. We just don't see it. And we take up the path of meditation, and the path of meditation and keeping the precepts is a way to come to understand what we're actually doing. And hopefully we might even encounter a teacher who we can tolerate, and maybe even over time come to trust. So we just don't see what we're doing. And maybe, and this is quite likely, we're not unintelligent beings. We might recognize that we don't see. And this comes to the first reason why we might take vows, why we might vow to keep the precepts. We have this intuition that there is something in practice. There is something more in life. There is something that is found through practice, and that the Buddhas and ancestors have found and lived from. We have this intuition. It's a tiny, sometimes a tiny, precious intuition. This is what we call bodhicitta. This is the Buddha calling to the Buddha within our heart. And I want to say it is tiny and precious because we should try to guard and protect that intuition, that feeling there's something more. Even though the world and all its complexities is saying, yeah, no, nothing more. Get what you can while you can. We have this intuition, there's something more. And we see honestly about ourselves that there are many obstructions to that something more. There are many aspects of ourself that are not in accord with that something more. There are many dark corners of our heart. And so we recognize that the following of that little flame, that flame of bodhicitta, will be long and difficult. One day I was talking to a Theravadan bhikkhu, and he asked me, we were talking about the certificates that you get when you take the precepts. And he said, why do you give people these pieces of paper? What is that about? And I was a little surprised. I didn't realize they didn't do this in other traditions, but as I was thinking about it, I thought, well, these are just kind ways of helping beings. And indeed, the vow, the possibility of taking a vow, like the precepts or the Bodhisattva vows, is the Buddha's kind skill and means offered to us out of his mysterious compassion. Take a minute and think about this. The Buddha set aside a very comfortable life, led a life of difficulty, his own practice. He realized enlightenment in 6 or 7 years. He could have gone off and just enjoyed his enlightenment, but no, he spent the next 45 years or so teaching and helping beings, articulating the Dharma. There was a point, it is said, after the Buddha awakened, where he was thinking to himself, wow, this was very difficult. It was difficult to find this enlightenment. And when I look around, I don't see a lot of people who will want to go through this difficulty, and it will be hard to teach even them. Why should I do this? And it is said that, so it's a little bit of a mystery in a certain way, why the Buddha has such a deep compassion and love of beings that he would undergo the difficulty that he did. It's said that one of the guardian kings came to him. It said, actually, I've heard a story that says Samantabhadra came to him in the form of one of the guardian kings and said, no, look about, Holy One. There will be beings with little dust in their eyes, and they will want to hear what you have to say. So please, please teach the world. And the Buddha was encouraged and went out and did. So it's a little bit of a mystery still. Why do the Buddhas and ancestors undergo the difficulty that they do to help beings? Anyway, they do, and I'm grateful. So one of the things that the Buddha comes up with is, well, people can make a vow. They can say, wow, in this moment, with this intuition, this sense of things, I feel that this would be good for me to do through the ups and downs of my life. I feel that it would be good for me to take the precepts. I feel that making a vow will put some weight behind it. When I feel like I don't want to do it, I will have made this vow and it will put some weight behind it. Because in a way, the vow is asking for the Buddhas and ancestors, the Sangha, our teachers, our good, compassionate friends, our good spiritual friends, to help us on the way. And as we go along, we realize the project of practicing the Buddha Dharma, of converting ourselves, is a very big project. Some of us will have the intuition, the insight, the experience that this is not the first time around for us. In the past, I've practiced. In past lives, I've practiced. In past lives, I've created suffering, and I'm getting the consequences of all those things in this life. And so I have to assume, for my own personal self, I have to assume there are going to be future lives. And here I am today, in this moment, building a foundation for those future lives. And by making that vow, making that promise to keep the precepts, it means that I will encounter and be guided by those precepts and the Buddha Dharma in future lives. We make a vow to do the effort of practice, and that vow, the power of that vow is returned to us by the Buddhas and ancestors, by Buddha nature itself. We ask for the help of the Buddhas and ancestors. We ask for the help of Buddha nature. And when we make those vows, and that help is given to us. There are many different aspects of why we practice with others. I think at its basic core, we practice with others because that is the nature, it is the nature of existence for us to be in the world connected to beings. The Buddha taught monks to renounce the world and live apart from worldliness. Now I want to repeat that. To live apart from worldliness. But one of the things that the Buddha did was, he said, well, monks, in order to make a living, you need to go out and beg for alms. You need to live on alms. And there are rules around that that mean you can't really control who gives alms and what they give. So he says you need to live apart from worldliness, but you need to recognize that you are enmeshed in the human world. You are part of the human world. And you cannot be separated from it. There is much training that can go on around this. My personal view is that the important precept that we're looking at in this age of humanity is the precept about pride and inadequacy. We're constantly trying to figure out myself. Who am I relative to others? And when we take up the study of this precept, there is much fruit to be gained. And living on alms and separating ourselves from worldliness, we really have to dig deep into that precept. I'm not better than anyone because I renounce the world. I'm not worse than anyone. I'm not the same as anyone. It all points to letting go. So we take vows and we live among others. The first of the vows, of the Bodhisattva vows, however innumerable beings may be, I vow to save them all. I have to concern myself with the welfare of others. It is imperative. But often we get a little bit wrapped up in that. We kind of forget about the other ones, the other aspects of the Bodhisattva vows. However inexhaustible the passions may be, I vow to transform them all. However limitless the Dharma may be, I vow to understand it completely. However infinite the Buddha's truth is, I vow to realize it. These are big, big aspirations. And we need to take them seriously and look deeply into them. And they condition then how we train and practice with others. They fill out, they expand, they give texture to how we practice with others and how we relate to basic existence itself. So, as I say, these are big vows, maybe bigger than we can really imagine. Again, this is okay. This is the Buddha seeing beyond our immediate suffering. What the Buddha offers is not something for exotic, special beings to practice. It is for human beings just like us to practice. And we live out these vows just in our day-to-day life of practice. We keep coming back to this present moment, the step that we need to take in this present moment. We keep letting go, we keep looking up, even though it doesn't make sense to us. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha.